I'm happy to welcome you to the last panel of CSPC 2022. If you haven't seen me introduce another panel, I'm Alessandra, a CSPC volunteer with the editorial committee, and this is your last chance to pick up our magazine.
Alors, ce sera votre...
Je m'appelle Kayona et je suis...
My name is Kayota, and I'm very pleased to present you this final panel of the day. And the title is Words Matter, Science Advice in Linguistic Realities. And it's sponsored by the Fonds de Recherche du Québec.
Translation available in the back. There are headsets that will translate in real time if you are mostly an English speaker.
Une dernière annonce.
So, one last announcement, and that is that this next session is going to be mostly in French. If you need interpretation services, hashtag at CSPC 2022. Don't forget to fill out the survey so that CSPC 2023 is even better.
Merci beaucoup. Une petite précision.
Just a quick clarification. It will be bilingual as much as possible, because our colleague from Chile is going to be speaking in English, and her two languages are, in fact, English and Spanish. So, hello to everyone. So, first of all, I would like to recognize that this meeting is being held on the unceded traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Algonquin Nation, who have been keepers of this land since time immemorial. We recognize that they are the guardians and traditional defenders of the ecographic watershed of the Ottawa River and its affluents. We salute their long tradition of hospitality.
Ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation, I recognize my own experience of privilege in having grown up here, and in the continuing privilege I have and benefit from in being able to visit here from time to time from Aotearoa, New Zealand, where I now make my home. And some of you may know this, but in Aotearoa, the tangata whenua, that is the people of the land, the Maori, who are our hosts, from Maori, every New Zealander, no matter whether they're Indigenous, whether they're born there or not, they learn that you must identify yourself in meetings such as this in a formal and established way. And that is to identify connections with the people around you. And the way to identify yourself is to identify your whenua, that is the land, and in particular, the closest river and the closest mountain that have nurtured you and your ancestors. So that's what I'll do. I can tell you that so many times every week in every meeting I have in New Zealand, I have the great honor of saying the following. Ko Gatino te maunga, ko Rido te awa, ko Canadians toko iwi, ko Christian Allen toko ingoa. My mountains are the Gatineaus.
Mes montagnes sont...
Is the Rideau. I'm gonna cry. My people are Canadians, and my name is Christiane Allen. And saying these words of greeting in this way, in the way that I have been instructed to do by Maori colleagues, is not just, hey, how are you? This greeting does an enormous amount of work in just a few words. It immediately establishes our human connections, but it also provides a consistent and humbling reminder of the importance of our bond with the land and with nature. It challenges us to understand that we are part of an interconnected set of relationships that are ancestral, human, and natural, and that we embody and enact every day. And so with this, I wish to welcome you to the panel this afternoon on, indeed, the power of words and language in the practice of science advice to governments. This panel, as you've heard, was organized by the Fonds de Recherche de Québec as the host institution for the office of the current president of INGSA, the International Network for Governmental Science Advice. And the president, of course, is Rémi Quirion, the chief scientist of Québec. I direct the secretariat of INGSA, which is located at Waipapa Taumatarau, or the University of Auckland. INGSA, for those of you who don't know, is a global community of practice for anyone working at the interface between science, broadly defined, and public policy making. And our network is free and inclusive and exists as a platform for exchange and capacity building, both institutionally and individually. And indeed, it's a great pleasure to see some of you here whom I know and have worked with through the INGSA network. L'idée de ce réseau a vu le jour il y a presque 10 ans dans un...
The idea for this network was born 10 years ago when the chief scientific advisor of New Zealand, Mr. Blackman, Rémi Quirion, chief scientist of Quebec, each had a similar thought on different hemispheres. And so they went to looking for the support of peers and create a community of practice that didn't exist up until then. So taking advantage of the General Assembly of what has become the International Council of Science in 2014, which was the first 2014, the first meeting of scientific councils, national scientific councils took part. And so it was decided to create a network to share knowledge and practices. And so the Wellcome Trust and CRDI answered the call, and we established the chapters in Chile and elsewhere in America to develop institutional capacities.
Enabling further development of the network. And when Rémi Quirion assumed the presidency, he did so with 3 priorities. First was to complete the suite of chapters by adding North America and Europe, and we've had some discussion on that this week. Second was to build capacity and support and growth and learning in science advice at subnational and especially at municipal levels to better enable that vertical integration of advice. And importantly, a third priority was to explore and share learnings on the influence of linguistic and by extension, cultural diversity in the practice of science advice to governments. And so it's this third priority, obviously, that's our subject today. So I am delighted to introduce to you our distinguished panelists who will be joining me for this discussion in this afternoon. And joining us online, I hope you can see her online, is Dr. Soledad Quiroz Valenzuela. Hi, Soledad, nice to see you. And she's a researcher in open science at Universidad Central de Chile. And she's the former executive secretary of the Chilean Scientific Committee on Climate Change, and also the current vice president of INGSA, specializing in the interface of science and policy. And then we've got, at the far end, Monsieur Jacques Vera, Deputy Head of Unit for Science, Policy, Advice, and Ethics at the European Commission. And I should say the European Commission has been a great champion of INGSA over the years, and so we're delighted to have you here. And of course, to my left, our own Professor Frédéric Bouchard, the Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at the Université de Montréal, who's also a philosopher of science. Every panel needs a philosopher of science. Great, and so in kicking off this panel on linguistic diversity, I have to say I am acutely aware of our limitations. So while we do offer simultaneous translation in English and French, with a big thank you and a shout out to our translators, because I know it's a difficult job, we are very limited in the sense that for those of you for whom this is not your first language, we're asking you to stretch into one of these languages, and we know that there can be privilege and power exercised through a dominant language. And it's our job to recognize that, to not take it for granted, to keep it in check, and to try to rebalance that structure, which is exactly what we're here to discuss today. And so let me just set the scene quickly. The panel topic stems from the recognition of the growing need to coordinate efforts to address shared complex challenges that play out across borders at multiple levels of governance, from the global to the hyperlocal. And despite the lack of shared language, we must try to transcend these differences and reach common views and collective solutions. Thus, this question treats language not just as a communication device or a background condition, but as central to our ability to understand the full scope of an issue and to contextualize an issue properly, or a set of issues, a set of interconnected issues, a set of interconnected transboundary issues. So at least we have a hunch that this is the role that language plays in this way, which is a good place to start unpacking the problem with our panel. And we know that language can be viewed through multiple lenses: a sociological lens, an institutional lens, a very operational lens, just as a start. And I think we'll hear probably from all of these perspectives today. So the format of the panel will be the following. I'll start with a provocation, a first question to our panelists, the same one for each of them. And in answering this is really their opening statement. And next I'll have a specific question for each of them, followed by some conversation here at the table as they respond to each other a little bit, and then we'll open it up to you, to the floor. And again, just as a reminder, obviously, it's in English and French. We encourage you to speak to us in either language in which you feel comfortable, and as usual, there are the microphones for you to come to at the end. But let's kick it off with the first big question, and here it is. So some would argue that science is a universal language, and that English is de facto the language of science. And what I'm interested in is in what ways are these assumptions problematic, if you think they are, for the process and the practice of science advice to governments. And I'll just, as a reminder, what I mean by process is that full arc of a process of science advice. So from the moment of conducting the research and identifying a problem, framing up that problem in order to be able to generate evidence, the interpretation of that evidence, the brokerage of that evidence, the commissioning of evidence from a policymaker's perspective, and the application of that evidence, or perhaps not. So process being that full arc. And I think we'll start with maybe go in this order. We'll go from Frédéric to Soledad to Jacques on this, about 5 minutes each.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for being here. You're the proud, the Friday afternoon attendees, and thank you very much for staying for this panel. Pour les traducteurs, je vous remercie.
Aux interprètes, to the interpreters, thank you very much. I will try to speak slowly when I speak French, first and foremost for the interpreters, but also for you who have made the effort to learn French at some point during your academic career, and will get an opportunity to exercise those muscles here today. So if I speed up, I apologize in advance, but I will do the best I can to speak as slowly as possible. And I understand. And I also want to express, we talked about the irony that because we're holding this panel while using English as the dominant language. And of course, the dilemma is always to choose between being heard and being understood. And when we talk about issues like this one, we hope that both are possible. We hope to be heard, but we also hope to be understood, which makes the exercise fruitful, but also very taxing.
Translate everything. I want to reassure you, but the idea, the difference between being heard and be understood is crucial to understand knowledge production in many fields. So the question of whether, so as a philosopher of science, so this is not Dean, this is not, as a philosopher of science, I'm asking this question more on an epistemological footing. So to say that science is a universal language, it's aspirational, but I'm not going to look at that part. The question is whether English or any, it used to be German, it used to be French, so whether the de facto language of sharing scientific knowledge, should that be kind of a de facto constraint on knowledge production itself? And I want to compare two things that shows the limitations of this approach. So one could argue, and I'm not going to go deeply to the philosophy of science or the sociology of science of this, so I'm taking this very superficially. But let's assume that an atom is an atom is an atom. Whether you say atome or atom is the same object. Now, for social sciences, for humanities and social sciences, that is not so simple because the phenomenon is locally mediated by cultural forces. So if I use the word literacy or illiteracy, right? If I say illiteracy in Japan versus illiteracy in Brazil or illiteracy in Quebec or in France, we understand what family of phenomena we're talking about. But the object itself will be very different because the difficulty of acquiring a language, or let's say the process of acquiring a language, will be different in Japanese, in Portuguese, or in French. So language is intrinsically part of many phenomena in social sciences. So to say that science is universal, de facto is English, sure. But that doesn't take anything from the fact that many objects that scientists study are deeply culturally mediated and deeply linguistically mediated. And therefore, to say, well, why don't we all just speak English? Or, a century ago or more to say, oh, why don't we all speak German? Or why don't we all speak French? Or why don't we all speak Latin, right? I mean, it helps in sharing information, of course, but you cannot adequately describe, the full complexity of the human experience without taking into serious consideration the language itself. And so my first point, and we will come back to other points later in discussion, but is that oftentimes, and these are relevant aspects of the question, we talk about language in terms of either political or legal, with legal considerations. But I'm going to put those aside for a moment. There's an epistemological consideration. So you cannot fully account for the human experience without taking seriously, not just language, but the factors or the different parameters of human experience. So language in knowledge production is not just how we share information in some communities, it's part of the object of study itself. And this is true in social sciences, but actually it goes much further than that. And I'll end with this. It affects public health. It affects self-reporting of health outcomes in clinical trials. So this has effect for many, many different types of scientific explanation. And therefore, you need to have research capacity in different languages to account for the full spectrum of human experience.
Merci beaucoup. I think we'll take that same question now. Before we get into the discussion around it, we'll take that same question to Soledad online. Soledad?
Hi, hello, Christian, everybody who is in there. I want to thank you for the invitation. This conversation we are having for a while now with Remy and other people from INSA. And from the global South perspective and the policies that are usually more involved, we have two main problems with this statement that you mentioned. One is when I want to take advice, take evidence and research from the global North that is in a different language from mine, which is Spanish. As a scientist, I have a process to make, but as you can see, I did my PhD in English, I studied in English. I have no major problems. In fact, it's easier for me to take up information, technical information in English. But when I want to give it to decision makers in my country, that is a different thing, because very few of them have a second language. So translating this very technical, precise information, evidence, scientific evidence to a political person who has a completely different background and also has another language with the complications that Jack's already mentioned, we really have to figure out a correct way to make the message really understood. So it adds another layer of complexity to our conversation and to the process. On the other hand, when we as Global South or Latin America want to participate from global conversations like climate change, biodiversity loss, or how to manage with big emergencies, our research, our information is not in the main English language. So sometimes it's not considered when global discussions are made, global decisions are taken. This was clearly shown by a research paper on 2020 that stated that between 15 and 25% of the information on biodiversity was lost, was not considered at global level because it was not reported in English. So we are actually losing a lot of research globally on topics that are vital to our livelihood because they are not in English. So it is both ways. It is more difficult to uptake the evidence, and it's more difficult to participate of the decision making at the global level when we don't have the same language and the same power. So it's really, it goes to that. Our problems sometimes are not as strongly considered because we cannot report in the same language. So for policymaking, that is the major, I'll say from my perspective, those are major points.
Thank you very much, Soledad. I like how you've added a layer there, whereas Frédéric, you've already talked to us about this idea of being locally mediated, where the phenomena is locally mediated. And so Soledad talking about not just speaking a different language itself, but also moving from technical to political, moving from international to local, moving from actual one language to another, these layers of complexity. And you've also talked about within that the issue of equity, not just the issue of accessibility or inaccessibility, but within that is embedded the issue of not just equity, of whose voice is heard, which was touched on as well, but also of quality of science. You know, we should all be concerned about this. If there's a whole sort of sector of science that's not being heard, what is it that we're missing? So thank you for that. We'll turn now to our colleague from the European Commission, Mr. Jacques Verras.
Hi. Thank you, Christian. Yeah, the European Commission is a multicultural, multi-language entity, ladies and gentlemen, as you know. The context is globally, there are 7,000 languages, yeah? And half of the world's population speak just 6 native languages in common. So that is the context in which we speak. And so there's an eerie comparison between the loss of biodiversity and the expected loss of languages. We think that 90% of the languages, of the 7,000 languages, will be lost by the end of the century. And I wonder whether there's a coincidence. Yes. I will focus on the European Union, which is composed of 27 member states, and there are 24 official languages. And multilingualism and multiculturalism is embedded and enshrined in the founding acts of the European Union. It's an expression of national identity, and it helps also to preserve, I want to say, democracy, transparency, and political accountability. And each piece of legislation in the European Union is translated in all 24 languages and published in an official journal. It's open and free of cost and easily accessible, I would say. Each citizen or company can address itself to the European Commission in any of the official languages, and you will get an answer also in those languages. So if that is the case, why do scientists speak English? It's nice to have this concept, but why do they speak English? And what follows is an hypothesis, it's mine. There's no official policy on that, but I just want to share what my analysis is. Historically, scientists have spoken a common language. Scientists were international animals, beings, and they spoke a common language. It was Latin in the past, and it was mainly in Europe, and it is English now, and we are global, yes. And what is important, I think, at least for the polity that the European Union is, it's a cost-benefit analysis. Huh? What are the costs if you would go to really radical multilingualism, that you translate all the discussions, and what would be the benefit? Is anything lost if you don't do that? So what are the benefits of a lingua franca? That is the common language. Huh? It allows, as we discussed, to go across borders, speak with colleagues who you couldn't understand if they would speak their mother tongue. It allows you to read literature and ideas that would not be available if it would be in another language. So there's a lot of benefits. It allows cross-fertilization, which otherwise wouldn't take place. It allows community building, which wouldn't take place otherwise, through community of ideas that can only emerge if you can share those ideas in common. So there's a lot of benefits. And the drawbacks, yeah, Frédéric, you mentioned them. It is the difference between being heard, yeah, I can hear you, but I don't understand you, and being understood, yes. And maybe concepts and ideas and feelings and notions are lost. Yeah, that can be indeed a drawback. And the loss of precision, which you only have in your native tongue. But by the way, this is a side I didn't prepare that, but isn't it strange that our school system is not able to replicate the innate ability that we have as human beings to learn a language? I learned Dutch, that's my native tongue, without opening a book, without learning a grammar. I just learned it, and it's the language I know best. So why are school systems not able to replicate that? But that's a sideshow. That is not for now, but it's an important question, I would say. Yeah. And so the drawback is that there's a loss of cultural context. I agree with you, Frédéric. Yeah. And Soledad as well. You have this local and global that need to be bridged, and there's something that is lost. But as a conclusion, when you take it when you measure, put in a balance the benefits and the drawbacks, I think that at least English, the use of English as a language in science for science is pragmatic, and the drawbacks seem to be manageable, or at least the benefits apparently outweigh the drawbacks. So, however, science advice is a different animal. Science advice is not just science, it's science that is digested to be available to policymakers. That's a different animal. And how do we measure the absence of the use of different languages and only focus on English? Science advice always implies translation. And not just linguistical translation, but also translation in terms of concepts. And so there are three danger zones, I would say, in science advice where information and concepts can get lost. The first in the formulation of the question from policymakers to science advisors. What are the issues to address? If it's formulated in English, is there anything lost if the policymaker tells what he or she wants to have as an input from the science advisor? That is the first danger zone. The second danger zone is the communication of the science worded in English into relevant concepts for policymakers. There can be miscommunication of scientific uncertainties, a very important issue. It is not only linked to languages, but science inherently, there's a level of uncertainty. How do you communicate that beyond the use of languages? Very important and very difficult in a political context, because politicians want to have answers and not questions. And scientific uncertainty is a form of a question, in fact, that is posed. And in fact, politicians need to bridge the uncertainty that science inherently has. There's a challenge of science for policy. And the third danger zone in terms of translation is the political realities and the need for positive messages. And that can trump the scientific insights. Science can provide unwelcome insights. So climate change deniers don't want to hear the realities that science can bring to the table. And if as a scientist, I would do a full life cycle assessment of photovoltaic cells or electric vehicles, it may not be so green as politicians want us to believe. So there's all these translations that can cause, that are danger zones and that we have to deal with beyond the language that we use. So in conclusion, the reality of English as a lingua franca is inspired by a scientific tradition, pragmatism, and has more benefits than drawbacks, I think. That is my conclusion. We can dispute that, yes.
We will.
However, in the uptake of science into policymaking through scientific advice, content can get lost or be distorted, not so much because of the linguistic reality, but because of conceptual issues and political realities. And therefore, we should be aware of it and make that science advice systems are robust, resilient. For example, through peer review, deliberative production, multi-party validation moments in the chain, and awareness of political realities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I especially appreciate you having taken us through that arc, and we started a bit of that conversation with our other two interlocutors as well, but really to understand that distinction of what is science advice. You said it's a different animal altogether, and I think that that's key here in terms of being able to label phenomena as well and bring those into that conversation with decision makers in a way that can be as precise as possible. There were also other elements that came up, which I'm sure we'll debate and discuss when we open it up, but that idea of cost-benefit analysis, I mean, those of us in the room who are social scientists might immediately jump to define that, define costs, define benefits. And I see Soledad nodding as well on the screen. So we will open this up, and I want to ask my colleagues here to keep those thoughts and ideas in your mind, because you'll have a chance to get back to each other and respond to each other. But one very another sort of quick round of questions, maybe 2 minutes each. I'll turn to each of you. So Soledad, speaking specifically about your situation, I mean, you've worked in the government of Chile in climate change responses. You are now a researcher, so you've seen both sides within universities and within governments. And you've seen how institutions operate, whether it's something coming into law on one side, or whether it's how we generate knowledge, the institutions of science and peer review, and how knowledge is legitimized. And so I'm wondering from that perspective, what kinds of structural challenges, you've already alluded to some of them, but what kinds of structural and challenges you've encountered in linguistically diverse contexts, but more importantly, how have these been overcome, or have they even? Have you got some hopeful examples for us?
Yes, actually, I think my experience is more positive than negative in that aspect. But I think more than language, the cultural differences is what's been more difficult to address. So these cultural differences between scientists and policymakers on one hand, but when you want to encounter even transdisciplinary research, that's also a challenge. I'm now working in a team of very diverse backgrounds, and we have a psychologist, we have a technical biochemist. I am more in a social science role. We have an historian, we have a journalist, and I think, so we all have different expectations of how to proceed to overtake a problem or a task. So everyone has a different way to approach a question, if you will. And we have to take a lot more time to talk through and talk to each other to come up with one common way to address a problem or a task. And we have a great team of people who recognizes that that's a major, is of major importance that we take that time and then proceed together. You know, sometimes you don't have either the time or the people that recognizes that differences in the cultures, and that makes the whole work much more difficult. The same thing happened, for example, when we advised to the legislature. We found as scientists some mistakes and that's why I was nodding, because I remember we have found some mistakes or missing points in definitions of a law. But we recognized that because we were experts on the topic, and we bring that up, and they were very curious because they took that definition from official organizations that did not translate the whole definition of the problem. So because this definition was not completely translated in the website, our laws were not getting the whole characteristics that we needed. But we experts took upon that, and we were able to correct that quickly. So that recognition that we are all experts in different fields and we have to work together to get a better product, a better job done, I think it's more an attitude than a formal instruction from our structure in the work.
Mm-hmm. And I thank you for that. I mean, I think what you brought up around working increasingly in a transdisciplinary way, you know, beyond multidisciplinary into transdisciplinary, I think that's made it even harder if there's not a shared language. And so the challenges are deepened further. and adding yet another layer of complexity to the question when scientists from multiple disciplines come together. But thank you also for that hopeful story of how you can catch errors and not let them go too far. I'll turn actually back to Frédéric and yeah, want to turn it around a little bit and think about this question from more of a strengths-based perspective. So we've sort of thought about a lot of the challenges. But from a strengths-based perspective, how can we think about linguistic and indeed cultural diversity as an enriching factor in terms of generating evidence and making that leap from evidence into science advice? So in other words, what does that kind of linguistic diversity bring to the table that might not otherwise be there for evidence-informed advice?
So first, I would say the word enrich is too weak. I mean, I'd say it's necessary. It's just it's not whether it's nice to have. Is that you cannot account for the phenomenon and without that linguistic. Not for all phenomena, right? But for many human-related phenomena, language and culture will be part of the story. If you ask an ecologist to say, okay, you can do field work, you can take, you can be near the lake and you can see by yourself, or I can give you a written description of the lake and you can do the research based on the written. The ecologist would say, this is nuts. Like, no, okay, I understand, I'm being too harsh. So you're not gonna get written text, I'm gonna add pictures as well. And I say, okay, I'm enriching it, and then say, okay, I'm gonna film it and give you the film. And so it's a question of how, I like the word precision, is that how much precision and how exhaustive do you want to be? How good you want your science to be relative to human experience? Et vous n'aurez pas le choix.
You won't have a choice but to include, even if it's imperfect, even if the linguistic skills of the person or the understanding of the culture of the person you're speaking to is incomplete, that's normal. But even a partial understanding will increase your understanding of the phenomenon you're trying to understand.
Enriching is a positive, but I would say it's stronger than that, is that claims of exhaustivity or of reliability depend on the linguistic and cultural sophistication of your approach. Again, not to the same degree for all phenomena, but for many, many, many society-based or community-based or human-related phenomena, you will need to take account of it. And again, the latter point I think is also extremely important, but we can get that in the next question, is that for the advice giving, then there's another layer where that's significant, and that's related to trust. But we can come back to that in the latter point.
Thank you. Actually, thank you for that, and thank you for not just correcting my thinking on that, but really bringing us all around to this idea of the how essential it is. So enriching is not enough. It's truly essential to be able to make those kinds of claims. And what it puts me in mind of, you've mentioned social phenomena, but my experience from Aotearoa, New Zealand, for instance, is actually physical phenomena too. And for this, drawing on Indigenous language. So fortunately in New Zealand, Te Reo Māori has really experienced a resurgence. And one of the interesting things is just starting with place names. And what people who didn't know Te Reo Māori initially are starting to learn in understanding place names is that these describe natural phenomena that Indigenous people have known about for millennia. So that lake is the lake of, bubbly water, and that that mountain is where something happens, and those are embedded in the place names. So just as the most simple place to start, to lose that is to lose a lot of information. Thank you very much. So we'll turn back to Jacques Verras from the European Commission, just in the sense of thinking about solutions and thinking about strengths in how we can confront this question. I mean, you deal with a multitude of languages, 27 countries, 24 languages. Lingua franca is English, of course, and that can be helpful and useful in dealing with questions that are kind of straightforward around trade, what you have to deal with. But when it comes to actually the cultural norms and the values entering into these questions, I'm thinking, for instance, of even standard setting. It sounds like a technical problem, but actually has cultural norms embedded into it. Can you tell us about how this is dealt with in Europe and how, again, distinguishing that part where the advice is given, how that advice is developed, structured, and conveyed that can cut across these linguistic differences and maybe build consensus? Can you do that in like less than 2 minutes?
Yeah, sure. Anecdote. Last Monday, I attended the research working party where the research attachés of the member states, 27 member states, meet. Which language did they speak? English. The French, the Bulgarians, the Germans, they all spoke English. Only when the ministers meet, there's simultaneous interpretation, like now, here in French and English. It's only several. If the research ministers meet, I think there's 5 or 6 or 7 languages in simultaneous interpretations. Only when the prime ministers meet, there's translation in all the languages. That shows that despite everything we can say about the importance of multiculturalism and multilingualism, there's this reality that you have to manage when you're a polity that has to cover and deal with and manage 27 member states with 24 languages. You have to make compromises, and that's what we do. It's a compromise, and I realize that. And that's the way. It's of course benefit analysis. You may hate it, but it is as good as it gets. And and this is a political dimension to it. In the 1980s, I was responsible for building the first ever multinational police database in the Schengen information system. And the French officials at that time were forbidden to speak other language than French. But we didn't have resources to give them French interpretation for all those working groups. So we found a political solution, and that was that we didn't speak French, we didn't speak English, we didn't speak Dutch, we spoke a common language. And that was a political solution. Of course it was English, but we called it a common language, and therefore it was acceptable.
Thank you for that example. That's a very expedient solution to a very difficult problem. Can I just, we've got about just under a half hour, but maybe quick reactions from the panel to each other. If there's any thoughts that have come up in listening to your colleagues. Where shall we start? I'm going to go to Soledad.
So one of the things that stood out for me is definitions as a scientist are very important for discussions. And because it gives the limits of the problem, right? So when you have so many languages, like in the European Union, how do you manage? Do you take like a time limit in discussions when they are defining problems? How do you stop the conversation?
Thanks for that. Good question. Jacques?
It's the political imperatives. There's something that needs to be done. For example, the European Union needs to come up with a climate plan, or we need to get our head around how to go for the renewable energies. There's a crisis, pandemic, for example, and you need to do something. And the constraints of reality that impose what we do, and there's no way around it. So it's really the political reality determines the political what is politically possible. So politique, c'est l'art du possible, and this is really what it is all about, I think.
Thank you.
Frédéric?
Maybe you can jump off and take us to the latter point because it's related. The point you made about the difference between what language or languages you need to do science and what languages, the role they play in science advice. It's crucial to understand the issue of legitimacy and with experts in general. And this came up a lot in the previous panel. Trust and distrust, right, are a huge factor in science advice. And here is another role that being attuned to linguistic or cultural differences are especially important. And so to say a few things about that is that, so beyond the epistemic point that I was making about whether languages help you build better knowledge of certain phenomena. So let's say that even if we're just talking about atoms, okay? So atoms understood in a shared lingua franca and everybody's happy with the description. Then you're the expert and you have to motivate either policy or just your neighbor or whatever expert advice giving is. So legitimacy is key. And here we're at this weird moment, and I don't want to reprise the previous panel which described this at length, but we're at a moment where, in a weird way, it's the golden age of expertise. We've never had access to more experts in more field, with more content, with more ease. But for individuals and decision makers, because of that, it has never been more difficult to determine how to discriminate between experts that disagree. So let's say you have two experts. Let's say you have two reliable experts, and they say things that they're different. And you're, well, I'm not an expert. I don't know. Like I can't decide between the two. So you're looking for proxies of reliability. You're looking for other reasons to think that this person is giving you good advice. Now, especially for health-related issues, but not solely, but for health-related issues, philosophers, sociologists, looking at trust in experts, whenever there's a personal risk involved, right? So either health or any risk-based, trust is crucial in the individual, or if you're lucky, you trust an institution. If you're in a period like we are now, where there's diminishing trust in institutions, the trust in individuals becomes even more important. So how do you establish trust with an individual expert? You look for proxies that the person will be giving you good advice. Now, speaking the same language is part of that. It's not just understanding it. Oh, this person understands where I'm coming from, or understands my reality. It's about belonging. And I'm not saying that we have to do this all the time, but it's just part of science advice is legitimacy of experts. And if you have weakening trust in institutions, trust in individuals matters even more. And then you have to look at the success conditions of expert legitimacy. And there, it's for many groups who've had bad experiences, or populations that have bad experiences in the past with either institutions or experts, the bar for legitimacy is even higher for believing that the person giving the advice cares about my well-being. And that will be mediated maybe via language, maybe via skin color, maybe via cultural norms, but all of these are proxies that will be used by individuals to establish the legitimacy of advice. So you can build good knowledge. I've argued that you need different languages to build good knowledge, but then to have strong trust in expert relationships, not with everyone all the time, but you will need to be able to build this trust relationships, and with certain populations, it will be used, it will be more relevant to establish belonging than to establish whether they went to the right school, right? Whether the right diploma. And so language is one of the factors in trust building relationships, not the only one, and it will vary depending on the population and whether they have trust in institutions versus trust in individual. If you're part of a privileged group in any given country, chances are you have higher trust in institutions because they have served you well. So you may not even understand the expert giving you the advice. Say, oh, but somebody from this institution said this, so it must be true. It's much easier if you have trust in institutions, but then you're privileged in the first place. So the trust is in the whole system, if you will, beyond the individual giving the advice. And so language is one of the proxies in science advice for establishing the legitimacy of expert giving advice. And if you don't have that, if you're not taking that into consideration, you may have the best science on earth, you may have the best intentions on earth, but the person hearing you will not, be fully, it may not consider you trustworthy enough to risk something important based on that advice.
Yeah. Thank you. Proxies of reliability. That's making me think. I hope it's making everyone think. It's an important point, and it's one I think that is really the underpinning piece of that idea of trust, not only in the development but in the conveyance of science advice. And I think between the three of you, we've seen, how some of the issues play out that Soledad has helped us to understand and how those have been confronted. We've seen the underpinning epistemological issues around creating the knowledge, but also the trust and legitimacy involved in conveying it and whether or not it's understood and accepted. And we've also seen some of the very pragmatic ways that it's had to be dealt with in very real time, and also political pragmatism, as you said, that kind of political efficiency that comes into play. So we have about 15 minutes, and I just wanted to open it up, whether or not there's any comments or questions from the floor. So I see someone coming through.
Et n'hésitez pas, si vous voulez pratiquer.
And don't hesitate if you want to practice your French. This is your chance. I swear that others won't judge you. They will see your courage instead. But of course, don't be shy to ask your questions in English too.
Goedemiddag, Jacques. Ik heb een vraag, maar ik denk dat dat is te moeilijk voor allemaal hier. Zo, en Frans.
So I have a question. Between the power. So I have a physics diploma in environmental science. But can we use traditional knowledge and acknowledge the importance of indigenous languages in the process of environmental assessment, impact assessment?
To encourage diversity, linguistic diversity, and the richness of description of landscape and environment, and embedding that in using a universal language, what are the strategies we can use on having a glossary to be able to combine indigenous knowledge and languages within an English domain of a universal language? What are strategies we could use for that?
Yeah. Yeah, do you want to start?
Merci beaucoup pour votre question. Donc,
thank you for the question. So, for example, in the case of indigenous languages, if you have mastery of an indigenous language, that, of course, gives us more credibility with the indigenous communities that will want to inform us, for example, of a particular process that they're aware of. At an international forum, our legitimacy,
that relationship, that privileged linguistic relationship with an indigenous language, but then you can share in another language but your legitimacy is built in part by having that other language that has established that knowledge. So throughout this discussion, it's not ou, it's et. On ne devrait pas avoir à décider est-ce que toute la science.
We shouldn't have to decide whether all science should be done in English across the world. We should rejoice that we are at a time in our history where we have competent interpreters in the booth, we have Google Translate, and we have other tools at our disposal, and there's goodwill on the part of the people we're our interlocutors. Of course, I'll be speaking English at a table where it's the only common language between us, but it's not going to be at the detriment of developing research capacity at the local level in another language. And so it's that to and fro that will allow us, especially in the area of environmental science, local legitimacy that comes from knowing the language of the people that intervene and being able to share the content that's drawn from that at an international forum. So we need both.
Can I add something small? I think we should look at the example of Wikimedia. So Wikipedia has become a major player in the world. Everybody has looked up something on Wikipedia. Well, they have this system to encourage local communities to put up information in Wikipedia. And they have stretched out to the level of communities with so many languages that are in danger of being lost. And they have hired special translators, and they have put effort in those at-risk languages to be written down in Wikipedia, in the network, in the platform. So we have some registration of their knowledge, their way of communicating. I think that is fantastic, and that is based on local communities. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a great example.
Thank you for that example. There's another question coming?
Oui, bonjour, Camille Morin, je travaille.
Camille Morin, I work at Parks Canada. So I'm going to pose my question in French, and then I'm going to translate it. So my question has to do with the confidence of the public. And I also wanted to hear your opinion as to the confusion between scientific counsels or advice and the fact that it's often given at the same time as political decisions are made. So during COVID, for example, you had the chief medical examiner, and then there was a political choice or political announcement that was made by the government right after the press conference from the chief medical officer.
Between science advice and government decisions with health measures or... Yeah, merci.
Merci pour votre question. I will take the liberty to answer from my perspective at INGSA very quickly, just to bring one distinction to the table, because I think your example is very pertinent. We did see this, it's not quite along the lines of these linguistic distinctions, but we did see this science advice being given and then a political decision being announced. And I think it was the way in which the crisis, the pandemic, condensed that time from advice to decision and made it very visible. And I don't think that is necessarily always the situation. In fact, it shouldn't be. But I think that it was that particular situation, that particular pandemic time, that really turned science advisors almost into, rapid fire decision makers, or at least very close to decision making, probably closer than they might like to be at times. Or to be associated at times. So that's what I will put in there from the position of INGSA and what we've seen over the years in INGSA from that perspective.
Je m'excuse, je vais...
And I'm sorry, I'm going to reply in English because I'm going to, I get very excited and I won't be able to speak slowly when I answer that question. It's really a question dear to my heart.
Is key. So if you look for the different surveys in trust in experts over the last decades, scientists, so science experts, if you will, were the highest group in terms of trustworthiness in the American population, but you have other similar surveys elsewhere. All other groups fluctuated, the volatility was tremendous or declined. One group that declined even more rapidly than any other were elected officials. I'm not saying this is a good thing. This is just, this was, examined. So you've got scientific experts that are the highest group in terms of trustworthiness through the decades. The other groups declining, two groups declining a lot, elected officials and sadly journalists. During the pandemic, you had this kind of perceived, or induced perception that scientific experts were the ones deciding. So they were perceived to be in a power position. And so my hunch is, and we're starting to see this, is that, again, I'm not saying this is good or bad, that we should have done it differently. This is just, it's a descriptive claim and not a normative claim, is that one of the consequences of COVID management in how we brought experts so close in perception to decision-making is that there's going to be a weakening trust in experts because they'll be confused with either elected officials or journalists, communicators. And this is something that in the past, for better and for worse, the perception may have been that experts gave advice and then somebody else decided. So they seem to be at more arm's length to the decision. And therefore, if you're angry at the decision, it's not the scientists, experts. So this is really, we're going to be studying this for the next decade, but we're already perceiving kind of a shift in the trustworthiness of scientific experts, and it's correlated with the pandemic management. I'm not, like, it's easy for me to say this, I'm not sure there was a way of doing it differently, right? So this is more, it's a consequence of something that occurred. It's not a judgment on what occurred.
And I think all the more reason then for those, as you say, those proxies of reliability, because we've all been through this pandemic experience and seen exactly this phenomena. So all the more importance then for that language as a proxy. I see okay, we've got about 3 minutes.
Yeah.
We've got one more question, but you wanted to make a comment?
Yeah, we put networks in place to deal with crises, health or others. On the 22nd of November, we will issue a scientific opinion on crisis management. The most important conclusion is communication with citizens.
And so we need the tools to do that, the multilingual tools to do that when you get down to the hyperlocal. Your question or comment?
Oui, comment qu'on
Yes, how do you reconcile all the equity, diversity, and inclusion issues in research with the objective of being understood?
the accessibility of research of a broader audience with being understood in the end by when speak the same language, basically.
So idéalement,
Ideally, we mustn't require that every individual be able to exercise all of these functions at the same time, but we need groups or communities that are able to play that role. So concretely, within a research team, you may have one person, for example, that can speak the local language or the minority group language, or who belongs to a minority group that was underprivileged in the past. Then you can distribute the task to establish links with civil society. The individual burden is colossal, And so we have to help each other out and see how we can distribute the task. How can we create confidence networks that are based on the team, the strength of a team, rather than individuals? And I say teams as opposed to institutions because we have to rebuild confidence. And so ideally, we're going to be able to build institutions that are more deserving of our confidence. But to aspire to that from the beginning is probably unachievable at first. So we first have to start by rebuilding confidence at lower levels, at the individual level or at the team level within the research team, and then at the institution level.
Building teams comes back to what Soledad was saying about multidisciplinary teams, just as much needing the multidisciplinary as you do perhaps the multilingual within a team. We have one, I think, last person standing up who wants to get a quick question in. Can I ask you to be brief?
Yeah, thanks so much for the great discussion. I was going to try starting in French, but to save time, I'll not do that anymore. So just quickly, I did my my PhD in particle physics based at CERN near Geneva, Switzerland. Most famous for housing the Large Hadron Collider. And so that is an incredibly international community. We're working together with people all over the world at all times, and English is the language of science, so everything is in English. People are constantly giving presentations, and the English and grammar is completely de-emphasized. Spelling, it just doesn't matter. People are making spelling mistakes, grammar all over the place. Nobody cares, nobody comments on it. It is about the visuals that you're giving. Are you presenting the data well? Are you showing the observables and variables that you're presenting? And so now coming to government, I find that the focus is back on really well-written grammar in English. And so I wonder if there's something we can learn from that, maybe in government, focusing more on visuals a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for that observation. That's fascinating. And I see Soledad grinning. I'm sure you've got some experience of this. We might end with you, Soledad, to share your thoughts on that question.
There is a meme for
of course
us
there's a meme.
non-native English speakers that says, "You don't know how smart I am in my native language." Because it's a constant frustration for us to really express what we want to express. And the worst part is, as you become more fluent in the technical language, you lose the everyday language. And there are all sorts of ramifications, because when you want to publish, I'm going back to publish research in English, when you're not an English speaker, you get a lot of bad reviews and very strong reviews, very strong comments, and you get rejected a lot more when you make small grammatical or spelling mistakes. And that has led to Latin Americans to excuse themselves before they start speaking in English, because they are aware of their failures in that translation, which is much more forgiving I believe in other more multicultural languages, when you are used to having all sorts of different accents. So I think it all goes back to recognizing we are all humans. We don't know everything. We cannot know everything. We cannot do everything perfectly. And just be kind and give space to each other. You can always ask someone to be more, to correct your policy brief because there's some grammar mistakes, and put someone who has a great grammar. I was once corrected by an American student doing a short stay in Chile. He will correct our Spanish because he will study our grammar much better than we did. So, I mean, if we go back to let's calm down, chill out, and concentrate on getting the message across. What's what we want to say, why we want to say it. I think if we concentrate on that, we can do a lot of things.
And on those parting thoughts, thank you so much. That's a very practical and human, I think, advice to remember that we are all sort of on the same team and trying to get something done. So with that, please join me in thanking all of our panelists. Soledad Quiroz Venezuela, Jacques Veras, Frédéric Bouchard. Merci beaucoup tout le monde.
Thank you all. And on that note, we are done. I'm going to follow your advice, Frédéric, and practice my French. And I apologize for any mistakes I may make. So it's the end of our conference. Thank you for this very fine discussion we've just had. Thank you, Soledad, Frédéric, Jacques, and of course, Christiane, and INCSA for having organized this excellent panel, and also, of course, the Fonds de Recherche du Québec. We've been very happy to have partnered with the FRQ. And is Judy here? Judy, thank you for having organized part of this conference. And to all of our volunteers, Katerina, Sophie, who couldn't be with us today, but who have worked on this particular panel. So I hope that you've had a wonderful experience at this CSPC 2022 conference. C'était bien?
At CSPC 22. This is almost the end of the, not almost, this is the end of the conference. 3 days of experience, excitement, networking, discussions, and very rich content, I hope. And we'll count on you to send your feedback, your remarks to us, and we'll have a survey which perhaps already sent to you. Please respond to that. We need your response and feedback to see how we can do better in future, and stay engaged with us. I hope you had a good experience at CSPC 22. Very much looking forward to see you in CSPC 2023 on November 13 to 15 here in Westin Hotel in Ottawa. Thank you so very much. Bonne soirée tout le monde. Merci.
Have a pleasant evening.